Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Von Manor, where Roger and I have returned. Because it's Wednesday, that means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, we'll talk about a certain comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue over on his channel will talk about the same comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team-up that we do once a week. And this week, we're talking about a really cool comic book that came out in 1977, published by Marvel Comics. And that is, of course, John Carter, Warlord of Mars. John Carter, Warlord of Mars. With a fantastic cover by Gil Kane, which is just amazing. So, this comic book is, of course, based off of Edgar Rice Burroughs' John Carter of Mars series. The John Carter of Mars series, also known as the Mars series, also known as the Barsoom series. Barsoom is the name that the Martians use for their planet. But mostly nowadays, I guess, it's known as the John Carter of Mars series, which went on for, I want to say it was 11 books in total, I think. I probably should have checked, but I didn't. And I'm not very good at counting, Roger. Math is difficult, you know, counting up to 10 or 11. It's hard, but John Carter of Mars. So this series began with a book called The Princess of Mars, where John Carter, ex-Confederate soldier, who also just happens to be immortal. He just happens to be immortal. It's a whole other thing. Anyway, John Carter, immortal ex-Confederate soldier, is mysteriously transported to the planet Mars, where he finds a very strange world full of bizarre creatures and people. The first people he runs into are 15-foot-tall green Martians with 4 arms and tusks, and they have swords, and they have rifles and pistols, which they don't use that often. And mostly they just use their swords and their short swords. And it's awesome. And of course, later on, John Carter finds out that there are a bunch of other people on Mars that look a lot like human beings from the planet Earth. Only they're red. And it's a great series. It's tremendous fun. It was the main inspiration for Flash Gordon, and had a lot of influence on Star Wars, actually. And Star Wars, of course, came out the same year that this fantastic comic book did, John Carter of Mars. And I have all of the regular issues. I don't have the annuals, though. I don't know. I don't think I have any of the annuals. I've read them. I do have this collection. This is John Carter of Mars, Warlord of Mars, which reprints the entire series. This came out in 2010. I think it came out in 2010, but let me make sure. Are you going to tell me? 2011. It came out in 2011. So it came out a year before the John Carter, the ill-fated John Carter of Mars film did from Disney. And that movie didn't do very well at all. It's probably a better movie than it's given credit for, the John Carter of Mars film. It is entertaining. They made a bunch of changes, though, to the character of John Carter and also the story itself, which I think were completely unnecessary, as is often the case in Hollywood adaptations of books. But oh well. But at the time that this was printed, Dark Horse Comics had the rights to the character John Carter. And so they printed this, which reprints the cover of issue number 1 and the entire series, but it does it all in black and white. So this came out when Marvel was doing its Marvel Essential volumes, which are these big phone book-sized collections of Marvel comics, but they were all in black and white. So perhaps that's one of the reasons Dark Horse just said, hey, let's just print this thing all in black and white because it'll be cheaper. It's of higher quality than the Marvel Essential volumes are, but it is entirely in black and white. But in the back, there are the annuals, and so I've read the entire series. Later on, Marvel got the rights back, and they did print an omnibus edition of John Carter of Mars, the Warlord of Mars series, but I didn't get it because I'm an idiot. Because I'm an idiot. You gotta snap those things up or they're gone. So the John Carter of Mars comic book, this was written by Marv Wolfman. Gil Kane and Dave Cockrum did the artwork for the first issue, and boy, did they do an amazing job. So there have been several comic book versions of John Carter and the John Carter series over the years. This one, I think, is by far the best. I think it captures the spirit of Edgar Rice Burroughs' original novels the best. Not perfectly, but I think they do a really good job. Artistically, I think Gil Kane captures Mars really, really well. There are some peculiarities in it. There are some things that are different than the original novel. I mean, the most obvious one is that in the original novel, everyone is naked on Mars. They're just naked. They have harnesses that they wear, which you can see on John Carter. John Carter has his harness on there that they strap their weapons to. But, you know, the whole loincloth bit, they don't have that. They're just naked. They're just naked on Mars. Which, you know, you can't really do when you turn it into a comic book or a film or whatever, which is probably just as well. But yeah, when you read the book, it turns out everybody's naked. It gives you another reason to read the story, other than just how awesome the story is. Now, in this first issue, we get some great, like I said, great artwork by Gil Kane. Gil Kane is just so good at fantasy action artwork. Gil Kane, who became popular in comic books because he was the first artist on the Green Lantern comic book for DC. And that's where his style really started to develop, was on Green Lantern, and that's awesome. I did a video on Green Lantern 100 years ago. But here we get some action on Mars with the Green Martians and John Carter. And if you go over here, we get a flashback of John Carter's origin. And it adapts part of A Princess of Mars. Now, one thing this didn't do is it did not attempt to adapt A Princess of Mars, John Carter's first story. A lot of times Marvel Comics would, if they were taking something from a film or a book, they would adapt the book first and then they would continue on, you know, with sequel stories. But not in this one. And I wish that they had, because it would have been awesome. I would have loved to see an adaptation of A Princess of Mars drawn by Gil Kane. That would be incredible. But this doesn't do that. This story actually takes place at the end of A Princess of Mars. In fact, the entire Marvel John Carter Warlord of Mars series takes place in this little section at the end of A Princess of Mars, which is like this big 10-year section after the end of the main story in A Princess of Mars. John Carter basically says, and then I fought on Mars for 10 years. And then this other thing happened. And during that gap, that's when these stories take place. Which presents complications, because then you can't really use, or it makes it more difficult to use, a bunch of the characters and monsters that you see in the later stories. So most of the John Carter series of books takes place after these stories are set. And one thing is that John Carter, at the period that these comic books are taking place, was not the Warlord of Mars. He didn't become the Warlord of Mars until the third book in the Martian series, which is Warlord of Mars. Warlord of Mars is actually a title bestowed upon John Carter. So that's a thing. He's not actually the Warlord of Mars when these comic books take place. And I think the reason they didn't do that, they didn't adapt The Princess of Mars, is because if they did that, they would have had to adapt the first 3 books in the Martian series. And perhaps they felt like that would just take too long. They wanted to get to their own original stories. So they do. And the first story is The Air Pirates of Mars. And I have to say, this single issue with this amazing cover is the greatest single issue of John Carter, of any John Carter comic book. It's just beautifully done because the artistic team of Gil Kane and Dave Cockrum are just fantastic. This is the single best issue of the entire series. We have this scene that recounts how John Carter mysteriously came to Mars, which was a mystery. We never really learned how he came to Mars. He came like this, according to Gil Kane. And it's fantastic. And we get some great action there with the Green Martians. And the story is pretty darn good. The original story in here. We get some information about how they decided to do this comic book. This comic book came out at the same time that Marvel also started doing a Tarzan comic book. So they were doing 2 Edgar Rice Burroughs comics, Tarzan and this one. And they were both great. They were both great. In the second issue, which is this one with another fantastic cover, the inker changes. The inker changes to Rudy Nebres. And he's kind of a heavy inker. And I think he kind of weighs down Gil Kane's fluid style a bit. It looks great. I mean, he's a great inker. But for me, he's kind of a bit heavy, I think, for Gil Kane. But I'm not going to complain too much because the artwork was still really, really good. And you get some scenes in this issue of Helium, the main city that John Carter resides in with Dejah Thoris, the Princess of Mars. And it's interesting. Now, one of the things that this comic book gets wrong is that the Martians... I mean, the Martians in A Princess of Mars didn't even really know what clothes were. You know, they just thought it was... They thought it was some funky thing that just Earth people put on their bodies. They didn't really get it. In this, you see not just harnesses and loincloths, but a lot of different clothing that some Martians are wearing, which is just wrong, but it's forgivable because, like I said, they can't really have a comic book where everybody's running around naked. I guess you could now. You could do it now, but back then they were like, no, let's not do that. Let's not have a bunch of naked people running around in our comic. Again, doesn't matter. This is still the best version of John Carter that I've seen in comic book form. DC Comics had an interesting one. It came out in The Weird Worlds of Edgar Rice Burroughs. There was this comic book that came out when DC was doing Tarzan, called The Weird Worlds of Edgar Rice Burroughs, where they adapted the Mars stories and the Venus stories, I think, if I'm remembering right. And they had an interesting version of Mars, which wasn't this good. This was really good. The series stayed pretty good. When Gil Kane left the comic book, the artwork was still pretty good by the artists that came after him, but it was never as good. It never felt as faithful to the comic book, or excuse me, as faithful to the original novels, I should say. But still, the artwork remained pretty good. It lasted 28 issues. This is the last issue here of John Carter of Mars. There was an annual that came out around the same time that this one did, and that finished up everything. But this is the last regular issue. And if you look in here, the artwork is by Larry Hama and Richard Villamonte. And it's still pretty darn good. The artwork is still good. You still get that otherworldly feel. You still get that Barsoomian feel. And if you look over here, you can get a Cylon that's gold. You could get a Cylon that's gold if you want one. You know, everybody needs a gold Cylon, and there is a gold Cylon, you know, just in case you needed one. But yeah, the artwork continued to be really good. The comic book, I guess, wasn't doing as well as they wanted it to. Even though it came out in the Star Wars era, the era of the Star Wars films, when this kind of thing was really popular. But they had a heck of a run. They had a heck of a run. And like I said, this run was reprinted by Marvel in a really nice big omnibus that I wish I had. You could still get it, although it's very expensive. What's the last time I saw it for? It was like $170 was the cheapest I've seen it. You might be able to find it cheaper on eBay, I don't know. But I really wish somebody would reprint these original issues again, because they were great. They were great. And I know people always like to freak out when I show comics. I do normally keep them in the plastic with backing boards and all that. That's how I normally keep these comics, so don't freak out. People always freak out. Why are those not in plastic? Why are you holding them with your grubby hands? I just am. You know, because I take these out and read them over and over again with my grubby fingers. I know, it's nightmarish. But normally I keep them just like this. This is issue number 3 with another fantastic cover with John Carter over a white ape. So yeah, that was Marvel's John Carter, Warlord of Mars. I'll show you some other cool covers. They had a lot of really cool covers in this series. That's about as Gil Kane as you can get, I think. And a lot of these covers were really, really nice. Just some fantastic issues of Warlord of Mars. I didn't grab all of them, but I grabbed some of them so you can see. And here we have such a classic scene of John Carter battling alongside Tars Tarkas, who was his best friend on Mars. Tars Tarkas, the Green Martian. The Green Martian that he met as soon as he arrived on Mars, actually. So there's a lot of cool stuff. John Carter's not really dead. He's saying he's dead here. He's not really dead. He comes, see? He's back again. He's back again. So, yeah. John Carter, Warlord of Mars. This series is really cool. And if you ever do find, you know, any old back issues of this, if you ever find this hanging out somewhere, pick it up. It's an awesome series. It's, like I said, the best version of this that I have seen in comic book form. So there you go. I will shut up now, and you can go see what Steve Donoghue has to say. And I will catch you next time.